So to bring Finland in completely into this Western alliance is a pretty big deal, I'd say. It's not to say that they were truly neutral before. Finland and Sweden both participated, for instance, in the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But from a geographic standpoint, if you were to pull open a map, it basically means the Baltic Sea, which is extremely important for Russia, has been converted into a NATO lake. And there's just a few little parts that Russia is connected to, whether it's St. Peter's and then a little territory called Kaliningrad that are, now not in NATO, but basically all of the other Baltic states and now the Scandinavian states are brought into NATO. So it also strengthens this military encirclement of Russia, and it changes the military posture of NATO around Russia. And I think that's what, that is quite grave, and actually in a way is even more grave than just the accession of Sweden and Finland, the number of troops that are now being amassed for immediate combat with Russia.
So, it's interesting because obviously this war started because of NATO expansion, right? Of trying to bring Ukraine into the NATO fold. And now that the war, now that Russia invaded Ukraine over this, the West is doubling down. And then I've seen some critics of, obviously what Russia's done saying, oh, like Russia was so dumb. They invaded Ukraine to stop Ukraine from joining NATO, but now two other countries have joined NATO. Are Sweden and Finland joining NATO like as big of a security threat as a country like Ukraine? And if not, why not?
I'd say not. I mean, if we really just draw a balance sheet, I'd be interested in what you two think. You're both experts also on this. But I think that, Ukraine is the country through which the Soviet Union and Russia have been attacked. Those areas on multiple times. Those lands. The Baltic Sea, from a military standpoint, of course, there has been conflict and war there too, but I don't think it's quite at the same scale. And I'd say from a sort of cultural, ethnic, linguistic standpoint, obviously the connections between Finland and Sweden and Finland and Russia are not the same as the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. So it's not as central, no, to the Russian government. So in that sense, it's not the same. I think it's a little too early to draw the full balance sheet of the war. And this war is likely to continue into the winter, I would say, or even longer. I could be wrong. In a way, I'm certainly hoping I'm wrong. But from both sides, you can see why there's sort of a strategic reason to actually extend the war rather than to enter into sincere negotiations at this point to bring things to an end. So, this is a new era in global politics that has been initiated. It's shifting the alliances and the balance of power all over the world. How that all shakes out, which side is the quote winner, which in a way is a very simplistic way of even looking at it. I think, that's sort of just calling balls and strikes, looking at world conflicts. Instead, we're trying to understand how the world is reshaping. It's a little too early to say, but certainly if the standpoint of Russia, for those who say we have to prevent our military encirclement, the military encirclement is indeed strengthening around Russia. And I think that the economic pain of the sanctions has not fully hit Russia. On the other hand, the economic pain of the natural gas shutoffs have not fully hit Western Europe. So sort of which side ends up bleeding the most is basically the main question at this point from like a military standpoint. There's 300,000 more combat-ready troops that are going to be basically brought up to Russia's borders from 40,000 to 300,000 from NATO. Now, mind you, let's go back to February. The whole idea of like amassing troops on the border was considered a huge scandal when Russia did it. And people said, this could bring us to war. This is extremely dangerous. And yet when NATO wants to bring 300,000 troops up to Russia's borders, that's purely defense. And I think that these are the ways in which the U.S. media consumer is hearing words like the defensive posture of NATO, and they just declare it a defensive posture, and so therefore it's defensive. But in fact, this is very different. This is like when you bring 300,000 troops all along a country's border, I wouldn't even call it a tripwire anymore. It's almost like we're making it much more likely of a regional and in fact global and potentially nuclear war every time we expand the number of troops that are brought up to Russia's border.
No, I think it's a good point, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I would say I think the real fear was the opposite way. I don't think there's any real, and Putin spoke to this just the other day. I forget exactly which international forum he was, but he said he wasn't that concerned about the Finland Sweden accession, and said if they want to do that, they want to do that. We don't have the same. It's not the same issue. We don't have the same historical cultural ties. The point Ben mentioned about the previous wars, so we don't view it as a threat. So that's certainly what the Russians think. But I think neutrality was a threat to the West. I mean, if you read the most recent Foreign Affairs magazine,
yes,
there's an article in there.
Because you hate yourself.
What's that?
Is it because you hate yourself?
Yeah.
These days, Foreign Affairs.
You have to read what the enemy is saying, Rania. You have to.
You do. It's true. We do it so you don't have to.
Thank you. Yes, that's, again, patreon.com/breakthrough news. But, the article is by, a top fellow at CFR and also the guy's the head of the Chicago Committee on Global Affairs. And the whole piece is about how the U.S. needs to form this G12 that is basically a hardcore Cold War bloc of all the European countries, Japan and Australia, against Russia and China combined, and that they should do it explicitly, they should start drawing the lines more sharply, and that they should try to force a confrontation with every single country in the world having to choose, are you with Russia and China, or are you with this new quote-unquote G12? And so I think just the very idea of having any country in Europe be quote-unquote neutral is very dangerous to this concept of wanting to sharpen the spear in terms of the confrontation of Russia and China to try to maintain imperialism. I mean, as it was famously said many years ago, right? What's the real goal of NATO? To keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And it seems to be reverting to its exact original function.
I was going to say the exact same thing. I mean, I think when you look from the long view, what happens over the century? If Eurasia becomes an integrated economic and bloc, let alone a political bloc, where does that leave the U.S. as the global hegemon? It makes it essentially impossible. And in fact, the rules of globalization that the West had created ended up creating all these opportunities for precisely that to happen. So now they've actually had to unwind and roll back globalization because they actually want two separate world economies. They want two separate blocks now. And this is why I mean, from the standpoint of neutrality, obviously this war has ended the possibility of a lot of countries remaining neutral, which I think is where things were starting to go. If Germany has the Nord Stream pipeline, for instance, and is completely reliant on Russian natural gas, is it really possible that they're ever going to go to war and have a major conflict with Russia? It makes it much less likely, and it creates the infrastructure that then creates momentum for precisely that. So ending that pipeline was very important. Now Finland is going to come into the NATO camp. Ukraine, I think, obviously is going to end up, however the war ends, I think is fairly likely to end up in the EU as a Western aligned state. So from the standpoint of Russia's initial goal to have Ukrainian neutrality, I don't think that that's really on the table right now. Now, what the final shape of Ukraine is another question. So this whole era of globalization has now entered a completely new era, and it is like a new Cold War. And I think it's why you see countries like China, which has actually benefited from the rules of globalization, ironically, saying we oppose a Cold War mentality. And it's actually the US that's trying to force all countries into a Cold War mentality. Very interesting that the NATO summit took special shots at China. And it basically wanted to link Russia and China as much as possible. It says, hey, they're strategic partners, they're pushing authoritarianism, et cetera, et cetera. These were countries that up to a few years ago were begging China to invest its surpluses back into their economies, that had very active trade with China. Germany, I think, actually had traded more to China than China sold to it, one of the few countries in Western Europe. And now they're basically identifying China as a strategic enemy of NATO. China, just to remind people, is not in the North Atlantic at all. So why is NATO doing that? It's obviously that it's trying to reshape global politics along the lines of a new Cold War.
And as all this takes place, one thing we've talked about a lot on various breakthrough programs is who does this benefit? It doesn't benefit Europe. It actually harms Europe pretty seriously. It benefits American elites, I guess, but at the end of the day, like, Europe is just shooting itself in the feet. It's slitting its own throat. It really shows you that it's really just the US in charge, and it's forcing people to be on its team, even when it's against their own interests. And I actually think, when you talk about forcing this sort of like forcing this world on everybody where you have to choose sides, it seems to me we've already seen that a significant portion of the world refuses to do that.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And that's been the other side effect. I mean, we've been talking about Europe so far, but actually it seems that this war has been counterproductive from the standpoint of US hegemony in Asia and Africa, and certainly in Latin America. So these are the kinds of things that they'll look back on and say, did we make a mistake or not? And I think it's important to recognize that the US elite are not some omniscient, all knowing, all powerful people who always make decisions in their, for their best long term interest. They make lots of mistakes based on hubris and arrogance, which itself are come from being the empire, being on top for so long. You just figure you can do whatever you want and everybody else will fall in line. They're realizing those days are over. They're definitely over, and they're not coming back. Maybe it can work in Western Europe and work in a few countries here and there, but on a global scale, it's not going to work. And look at the economy. I mean, you raised it. Who is it really benefiting? Mm-hmm. I mean, 28% of Americans approve of Joe Biden's handling of the economy. His never lower than where Trump's approval ratings were. So, what exactly, he got a little bump in approval ratings during the beginning part of the Ukraine crisis and that's why I think he got kind of like really interested in pumping up Ukraine, because it would help his poll numbers. But ultimately, people moved on from Ukraine when they realized they couldn't afford gasoline anymore. They couldn't find baby formula. They couldn't find their most basic needs. And then people are really going to evaluate the government based on that. And who does this policy ultimately serve? Okay, now Sweden and Finland are going to buy more weapons from the US. Great. How does that exactly help the US working class, or the Finnish and Swedish working class for that matter? I mean, this is basically just helping military contractors. And ultimately, I think that all the governments that are following this policy are going to pay a heavy price politically, because people are not going to just stand by it forever.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, and we're seeing the fallout in real ways, certainly all across Europe. I mean, one of the largest unions in Germany, the head said whole industries could collapse, not just for the short term, but forever if there's any more serious cut in the gas, because, major industries are selling things. So if you have to shut down for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, other competitors around the world are just going to jump in there. And so, he was talking about glass and all these different big industries in Germany could just be gone forever. And to show how bad it is, the German economy minister said today, well, if necessary, they will turn on Nord Stream 2 because they don't want to let the country completely collapse. So that would just be the most unbelievable backfiring of these sanctions. But that's where we are in the broader scheme of things.
Well, just remember when after the Soviet Union fell, there was actually many people in Germany, in the German high command, who were really considering whether Russia should not come into NATO. They said, look, yes, Russia's basically under our thumb. Russia's capitalistic. Russia wants our help. Why not bring them into NATO? And this was not really tolerated or even considered that much in the United States, because once you brought Russia and Germany together, NATO would cease to become an instrument of U.S. Policy. NATO would then become an instrument of European policy, and they would follow European interests, which are not the same as U.S. corporate interests. And so actually, even a Russia then completely subordinated, a puppet Russia, could not even be brought into NATO, because it's a big country, and it was assumed, probably correctly by the U.S., that once Russia gets on its feet and pursues a more nationalistic policy, it would be impossible for NATO to remain under the thumb of the United States. And so they created another program, the NATO Partners Program, to sort of not turn away Russia entirely, but to kind of create this other place. That's also where they put Finland, by the way. And Finland was another partner for peace, or whatever this NATO thing was. That whole era is over. They brought Russia into the G8 also.
Yes.
And of course, they kicked them out over the Ukraine issue in 2014. So this is there was this sort of brief window where they were trying to figure this out. And obviously, they've decided for the foreseeable future that Russia is out, China is out. Great power conflict is what the world must prepare for, whether they want it or not.
Well, that's bleak, but it's where we are. So thankfully, the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with that. So, for those of us who don't agree with that here, we certainly aren't alone. Well, Ben Becker, editor-in-chief, BreakThrough News, as always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Big fan of the Freedom Side. Big fan.